It didn't arrive with trumpets. No balcony. No choreographed smiles. It arrived quietly, and that's what makes it unsettling. Because when Prince William confirms something without ceremony, without qualifiers, without the familiar fog of palace language, it usually means the decision has already been sealed. Not debated. Not delayed. Finished. And this time, the confirmation wasn't about policy or protocol. It was about children, and it was about endings. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Just minutes ago, William acknowledged what had been whispered for weeks in closed circles, but never spoken aloud. The royal titles of Meghan Markle's children will not move forward. Not now. Not later. Not someday when the dust settles. The door, as he framed it, is effectively closed, because, in his words, irreparable damage has been done to the crown. That phrase hangs there, doesn't it? Irreparable. Not strained. Not complicated. Irreparable. What kind of internal conclusion leads a future king to use language like that? Especially when the consequences fall not on an adult decision-maker, but on two children who never chose this path. This is where the story stops being about gossip and starts feeling like a turning point. Because royal titles aren't just symbolic. They are inheritance, identity, a place in history. And by confirming that those titles will not apply moving forward, William wasn't revising tradition. He was interrupting it. There's an irony here that's hard to ignore. For years, the monarchy has spoken about modernization, compassion, progress, about adapting to a changing world. Yet the decision confirmed today feels colder, sharper, almost surgical, as if the institution looked at its own future and decided something, or someone, had to be removed from the equation entirely. And at the center of it all is Meghan Markle, not named directly in anger, not attacked publicly, but unmistakably positioned as the dividing line. Ask yourself this. If the issue were temporary, why make it permanent? If reconciliation were possible, why shut the door before the children are even old enough to understand what's been taken from them? William didn't offer those answers. He didn't need to. His restraint said more than 1,000 explanations ever could. Because restraint, in this family, is often the signal that the most difficult conversations have already happened behind closed doors, among senior figures, without cameras present. And that raises the question no one is asking out loud yet. What exactly was discussed in that private vote? Who agreed and why? And what convinced the monarchy that the damage was so complete, it could never be repaired? Because once a crown decides something is irreparable, history suggests it never looks back. And what comes next may be even more difficult to hear. So let's stay with that moment. Not the speculation. Not the reaction online. The moment itself. Because what happened next is where this stops feeling abstract and starts feeling deliberate. This wasn't a leak patched together by tabloids. It wasn't a source says situation quietly floated to test public reaction. What made this confirmation different, and frankly more chilling, is that it came without hedging. No ongoing discussions. No review process. No language about revisiting the issue in the future. Just a confirmation. Clean. Controlled. Almost spare. That alone tells you something important. In this family, ambiguity is a tool. When the palace wants flexibility, it leaves room. When it wants time, it uses phrases like under consideration or subject to review. Those words were missing here. Entirely. Instead, William spoke as someone relaying a conclusion, not participating in a debate. And that raises the first uncomfortable contradiction. If this decision was purely administrative, a matter of protocol, why did it require his voice at all? Why not let it sit quietly in legal frameworks and letters patent, where most title decisions live and die without public attention? The answer may be simpler than it's comfortable to admit. Because the monarchy wanted this moment owned, and William wanted it understood as settled. There's a reason this confirmation came when it did. Timing matters. It always does. This arrived at a moment when silence would have allowed speculation to keep growing. Speculation about reversals, compromises, future reinstatements. By speaking now, William wasn't just clarifying policy. He was collapsing those possibilities. Ask yourself, when was the last time a senior royal voluntarily narrowed their own future options? That's not how this institution usually operates. And yet here he was, doing exactly that. There's another detail that deserves attention. He didn't frame the decision as punitive. He didn't say it was about punishment or retaliation. He framed it as protection of the crown, of continuity, of something larger than any one individual. That framing matters. Because protection language is what institutions use when they believe risk is structural, not situational. Temporary problems don't require permanent solutions, but structural threats do. Which brings us to the phrase that keeps resurfacing in private briefings: private agreement. Not consensus in the casual sense. Agreement after discussion, after assessment, after weighing consequences. This wasn't a snap judgment, and that may be the most troubling part. Because slow decisions suggest accumulated evidence. Patterns, not incidents. A sense that time itself has already tested every alternative and found them lacking. William didn't say how long these conversations lasted. He didn't say who initiated them. He didn't say what finally tipped the balance. But his tone suggested something else entirely: relief. Not emotional relief, institutional relief. The kind that comes when a question that's hovered for years is finally resolved. And if that's true, then today's confirmation wasn't the beginning of this story. It was the end of an argument the public never got to hear. Which leads to the question that matters more than all the others combined. What exactly was debated behind those closed doors? And what convinced everyone involved that there was no longer any room to wait? Because once you understand that, the decision itself starts to look less shocking and far more final. The palace has always preferred myths. Unity, continuity, family first. But none of that is how power actually works inside those walls. What William alluded to, carefully, almost clinically, was not a feeling. It was a process, a private vote. And that detail, slipped in almost as an aside, changes the entire weight of what we're witnessing. Because votes are rare here. Extremely rare. They are not used for optics. They are used when something has reached a point where silence is no longer sustainable and consensus must be documented, even if informally, among the very few people who are allowed to shape the future. So let's slow this down. This wasn't a public referendum. It wasn't a debate conducted through aides or press briefings. It was senior figures, in private rooms, confronting a question the monarchy usually avoids at all costs. Can the institution absorb this, or will it be defined by it? That's the tension beneath everything. And here's the first contradiction worth sitting with. The monarchy insists it is above emotion, above individual disputes, above personal grievances. Yet a vote like this suggests something emotional was deemed unavoidable. Not anger, concern. Concern deep enough that neutrality was no longer an option. Ask yourself, what forces an institution built on delay and deflection to choose decisiveness? The answer is never a single incident. Votes happen when patterns emerge, when risk is no longer hypothetical, when advisors stop asking what if and start asking how much more can this take. William didn't name who participated. That omission is intentional. Names would invite blame, speculation, fractures, but the absence of names doesn't diminish the significance. If anything, it amplifies it, because it suggests broad alignment. Enough alignment that no dissent needed to be acknowledged publicly. And that should give you pause, because consensus at that level doesn't come easily. It comes after failed compromises, after trial periods that don't resolve anything, after trust, once stretched, doesn't snap back into place. There's another layer here that hasn't been fully addressed yet. This vote wasn't about revoking something that already existed. It was about preventing something from ever solidifying. That distinction matters. It suggests foresight, not reaction. Prevention, not punishment. Which brings up the ethical discomfort at the heart of this story. Can an institution justify preemptive decisions about children based on adult conflict? Can it argue that future harm is inevitable and therefore must be stopped before it begins? Those are not ceremonial questions. Those are moral ones. And moral questions are the most dangerous kind for a monarchy because they invite public judgment. Yet the vote happened anyway. That tells us something else. Whatever information was weighed in that room must have felt heavier than the risk of backlash, heavier than the optics of appearing unforgiving, heavier even than the narrative of compassion the monarchy has spent years cultivating. Which means this decision wasn't made lightly, but it was made firmly. And here's the detail that insiders keep circling back to, even if they won't say it outright. Once the vote concluded, there was no appetite for delay. No phased approach. No provisional language. The result was treated as settled immediately, as if prolonging the process itself posed a threat. That urgency is revealing, because urgency suggests fear of escalation, of further erosion, of something becoming harder to contain the longer it remains unresolved. So the real question isn't whether the vote happened. It's what finally convinced the room that waiting was more dangerous than acting. And once we turn to who that decision affects most directly, the children themselves, the consequences become impossible to ignore. Because for them, this wasn't a vote. It was a verdict. And once you see it that way, the next chapter becomes far more difficult to look away from. And this is where the conversation shifts, uncomfortably, from power to permanence. Because institutions can debate policy endlessly. They can revise language, soften phrasing, delay implementation. But when decisions land on children, the abstraction disappears. Suddenly, the consequences have names. Birthdays. Futures that will now unfold without something they were once assumed to inherit. This wasn't about removing titles from Archie and Lilibet. That's the misunderstanding many people make at first. You can't remove what was never formally granted in the first place. This was something quieter, and in some ways more severe, a decision to ensure those titles would never materialize. No activation, no recognition, no moment where the door even opens. Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor and Lilibet Diana Mountbatten-Windsor exist in a kind of royal limbo now, connected by blood, but separated by designation. Known to the world, yet excluded from the formal architecture that defines royal life. And that distinction matters more than people realize. Because in this family, titles are not decorations. They are access points. They determine proximity to history, to ceremony, to influence. They decide who is footnoted and who is foreground. What was confirmed, quietly but unmistakably, is that this access will not be extended. Not when they come of age. Not after some imagined reconciliation. Not when memories soften or narratives change. The implication is stark. Whatever damage was cited isn't expected to fade with time. That's a heavy conclusion to reach about children who are still years away from understanding the institution that has already defined them. There's an emotional contradiction here that's hard to resolve. The monarchy has long insisted that children are protected from adult conflict, shielded, kept above the fray. Yet this decision embeds the outcome of adult conflict directly into their future identities. So ask yourself, and be honest, is this protection or is it containment? Supporters of the decision argue that clarity is kinder than uncertainty, that knowing where you stand is better than living with false expectations. And maybe there's truth in that. Ambiguity can be cruel in its own way, but there's another side to this, one that isn't being said out loud. By closing this door early, the institution also absolves itself of future responsibility. There will be no reckoning later. No difficult conversations when the children ask why they were excluded. The answer, effectively, has already been decided and sealed. That finality is what makes this moment feel so different from past royal disputes. This isn't a pause. It isn't a cooling-off period. It's a structural decision designed to outlast emotion, public opinion, even leadership changes. And that leads us back to the phrase that keeps echoing through all of this: irreparable damage. Because if the monarchy truly believed reconciliation was possible, truly believed bridges could be rebuilt, it would have left itself room to move. It didn't. Which means, somewhere along the line, the conclusion was reached that the source of the damage wasn't situational. It was foundational. And once that conclusion takes hold, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the children are excluded because of what surrounds them, what, exactly, did the institution decide could never be separated from them? That answer hasn't been given yet. But when it is, it may explain everything. The word itself did most of the damage. Irreparable. It's not a word the palace uses lightly. In fact, it's a word it almost never uses at all. Royal language is usually elastic, designed to stretch, to soften, to leave room for reinterpretation later. This wasn't that. This was blunt, almost legalistic, as if someone, somewhere, wanted to make sure there would be no confusion down the line. When Prince William repeated that phrase, he didn't embellish it. He didn't justify it. He didn't walk it back. And that restraint is exactly what makes it so revealing. Because irreparable damage doesn't describe a disagreement. It doesn't describe bad press. It doesn't even describe scandal in the usual sense. It describes something systemic, something that, in the institution's view, cannot be corrected by time.